We spoke about the different approaches of Yirmiyah and Yehezkel to the Galut of Yoyachim. By the end, I'm going to come back to the Galut of Yoyachim. But I want to mention now, to talk about, again, and I can't seem to get out of the book of Yirmiyah, so you'll just forgive me. I'll try and extract myself out. I'm just captivated. But I want to talk a little bit about, in Yirmiyah, and here I promise you won't have as many, you don't really need a Tanakh for this one, you won't have to shift around like you did this morning. I had you going all over Tanakh. Here we're going to focus a little bit on Baruch ben Neriah. And now that sounds like a strange topic, but I hope by the end you'll understand why I did it, and I hope it'll be a fitting end to Tish'a BeAb because of who Baruch was and how he ended and what happened to him at the end. So let's just give a little background. Who was Baruch ben Neriah? We know, of course, Baruch ben Neriah was the assistant, the scribe, and slash assistant to Yirmiyah. He's most famous for, in Yirmiyah, Perek Lamed Bet, Pasuk Yud Bet, and in that time, he is by Yirmiyah's side, and this is the first time where we see him as a scribe. What does he write there? He writes a bill of sale. He writes a bill of sale. Yirmiyahu buys a piece of land from his first cousin in Eretz Israel as the Khurban is happening. It's being destroyed. This is a perek that we actually don't read on Tish'a BeAb. It's one of the few Pirkei Nehama, right? Lamed to Lamed Gimel. This is therefore we don't read that because the message there is Nehama. But nevertheless, here we have that Baruch ben Neriah ben Mahasiyah, as he's called. Baruch ben Neriah ben Mahasiyah. Now, why do I want that pasuk? This certainly isn't his biggest achievement, but it puts him, this is the one time where we actually know who his grandfather was. And why is that important? Because it puts him in context of the family. If you go to Yirmiyah, Nun Aleph 59, we'll find something about that family. Hadavar asher siva Yirmiyah Navi et Shirayah ben Neriah ben Mahseyah. So this seems to be Baruch's brother, Shirayah ben Neriah ben Mahseyah, and we have Baruch ben Neriah ben Mahseyah. We could pretty much fairly assume that there's brothers. And what was he doing? But this person was we know elsewhere, and we've seen this a few times, that in Tzidkiyahu's 4th year of kingdom, he went and he went with an entourage to Melech Bavel, presumably to negotiate some peace treaty or something. And one of the people that go with him is a Shirayah ben Neriah ben Mahseyah, and he is called Sad Minuha. Right? That was his job. He was an officer of Minuha. That's hard to know exactly what that job is, right? Translates here, in charge of tribute, Minuha, like Minha, maybe some form of a financial advisor or whatever it is. Nevertheless, what we do see here is that this is a person who was connected in a very serious way to the upper echelons of control. He was a sub. He was very connected to the king. When the king had an important mission to go to Bavel, Shirayah accompanies him. And that is Baruch's brother. So we find that these are people who are connected to the king. And the next level, what does Yirmiyah do in this situation? Yirmiyah writes a book. He writes a book about all the things that are going to happen bad to Bavel. And who does he give that book to? And then what should you do? You're going to read this book, and after you're going to read this book, you're going to throw it into the Euphrates River. So, this is a person that not only connected to the king, but that Yirmiyah trusts deeply. with some very sensitive information that can get Yirmiyah in big trouble, and he's to dispose of it into the Euphrates River. So we find that this family of Baruch ben Neriah ben Mahasseah is an important family to the king, and they are people that Yirmiyah trusts, and they are sympathizers of the Nevi of Yirmiyah. So that is an important knowledge to know about the family and the background. Now that really tells us something important. Now let's get to Baruch himself. So now, Baruch now is a person who's seriously connected to the highest levels of government. And that means he has opportunities, like his brother, to be very importantly connected to the government. On the other. But what does Baruch choose? Baruch chooses, clearly, and this is a choice, this is not something he was forced into, to be Yirmiyahu's scribe and assistant. Now, that's not a simple thing, because it's true, we read, let's go and now look at where Baruch finds himself. The first chronological time that we meet up with Baruch, and it's not the first time in the actual book of Yirmiyah, because as we know, Yirmiyah is not written chronologically at all. It is probably the least chronological of all the books of Tanakh. If you follow through the dates that are written, and certainly the ones that are not written, and try and piece it together and figure out when they're written, it's a very arduous task. Just one quick example, you have Perek Lamed Vav is in the 4th year of Yehoiakim. You have Perek Lamed Zayin is already into the realm of Tzidkiyahu, we're not sure exactly where. Lamed Tet is it becomes in the 9th year of Tzidkiyahu. Mem is after the Hurban. Mem He is back in the times of Yehoiakim. Mem Vav we're not sure. Mem Het is into Yehoiakim time. We don't know. It's all over the place. So the book of Yirmiyah, to be understood, can never be understood in chronological terms. So the first perek that we meet up with Baruch chronologically is actually in the 4th year of Yehoiakim, when Yirmiyahu decides that he is going to write a Megillah. He's going to take all the Nibuot and write them down on a Megillah. And he writes the scroll. And as he writes the scroll, he actually gives it. Now, he cannot go anywhere he wants. During the time of Yehoiakim, he is under like a house arrest. It's not like in the time of SCA where he's actually in jail, but he's on some level of a house arrest. Now, this is a guy who's under house arrest, and Baruch is always at his side. That puts him in a very peculiar situation. We'll see how peculiar in a few minutes. So, ויקרא ירמיה את ברוך בן נריה, ויכתוב ברוך בפי ירמיה את כל דברי אדוני אשר דיבר אליו במגילת הספר. Baruch writes everything that Yirmiyah tells him to write. But now, ויצווה ירמיה את ברוך לאמור, אני אסור, I'm incarcerated. לא אוכל לבוא בית אדוני. Apparently Yirmiyah was not allowed to go to the Beit HaMikdash for a simple reason. Anytime he did go to the Beit HaMikdash, he did not keep quiet. He used it as a platform to say his message. So he couldn't go there. So what does he do? He tells Baruch, go. ובאת וקראת במגילה אשר כתבת מפי את דברי אדוני באוזני העם בית אדוני ביום צום. I want you to go to the Beit HaMikdash and read this on a Yom Tzom. Parenthetically, Yom Tzom, most Mefarshim call a fast day, right? Yom Tzom. Like today we have a Tzom. And that is borne out in many other usages of the word. And the reason you go on Yom Tzom is because that would be obviously a gathering, you'd have a good audience. However, Rasad, just as a side point, Rav Saadia Gaon translates Tzom the opposite. He translates Tzom as a day of gathering. We use, and he brings different context, we use Tzom to mean a fast because that's when they gather. So it's very possible, Rasad over here says, that it wasn't a fast day at all, that it was just a gathering day in the Beit HaMikdash. Other Mefarshim say it was a Yom Tzom because they were afraid of the of Melech Bavel, and apparently they lost a few bags. So Baruch is told to take the Megillah. That's a dangerous Megillah to read, and to read it publicly, and he does it. He does it, and that'll put him and Yirmiyah in a dangerous situation. Yoyakim is going to get this Megillah. Again, the development of what's going to happen is people are going to hear it, they're going to bring it to the officers. The officers, as we said in Yoyakim's time, were righteous individuals with a corrupt king, unlike at the time of SCA, where they were corrupt officers with a somewhat righteous king. And they protect, they hide Yirmiyah and Baruch, but the Megillah gets into the hands of the king, who proceeds then to cut it and burn it, and he searches out for Yirmiyah and Baruch, and they're in hiding. And in fact, how did they hide? Yirmiyah was under house arrest. How could he hide? And the fact is, the Nevi ends, the last pasuk, or not the actual last pasuk, it says, Vayastirem Adonai, in pasuk Kavav, meaning it was a miraculous point that they were hidden. It was not just a clear, just they went into hiding, because there are places that can go limited, so the Nevi actually says, Vayastirem Adonai. So Baruch is a person who avoids important positions. He's an important family. He has the ability to get important positions, like his brother, and he puts himself close to the Nevi at great peril for himself. If I go back to the pasuk that I read before, Perek Lamed Bet pasuk Yud Bet, when at the end towards the Harban, this is the end of Tzidkiyahu's reign, and Baruch is next to him. Baruch is with him in Hatzar HaMatara. We have no relevant psukim that Yirmiyah actually called Baruch for the purpose. Baruch is there, which would lead to the assumption that he didn't leave Yirmiyah alone even in Hatzar HaMatara. This is who Baruch ben Neriah was. Baruch ben Neriah is mentioned also in Perek Mem Gimal Pasuk Gimal. Perek Mem Gimal Pasuk Gimal. This is, put this in context, this is post-Harban. This is what we spoke about 2 days ago on Shabbat, in the time of after Gedaliah's murder. And Yirmiyah is asked by the people, should we leave Eretz Israel and go to Mitzrayim or not? And Yirmiyah says, I asked God, he said you should stay here. You should not go to Mitzrayim. And what do the people say? You're lying. And why are you lying? And here's, I'll read you this. He says, Sheker ameta medaber. Lo shilacheka Adonai. God did not send you. Lemor lo tavo Mitzrayim legosham. Pasuk Gimal. Ki Baruch ben Neriah misit otecha banu leman tet otanu biyad kastim lamit otanu laglot otanu b'avim. You know whose fault this whole thing is? Says these people. It's not you, Yirmiyah. You are lying, but you were under the influence of your assistant. You're under the influence of Baruch ben Neriah. He forced you to lie. He convinced you. We learned a few things. One, apparently Baruch did have, or at least people did have a strong relationship with Yirmiyah, that maybe he was somewhat influential on Yirmiyah at some point. As a student always, and a rabbi, who influences who more, it's sometimes hard to figure out. But the people use him as the scapegoat to blame. And this is Baruch ben Neriah's position. No, so that's a good question. Why they thought Yirmiyah was lying was not so related, not so much related to people. Oh, why would they think, okay, good. That's another question. Why they thought Yirmiyah was lying? Probably because he said something they didn't want to hear. Why would they think that Baruch ben Neriah would possibly have an interest to make Yirmiyah stay in Eretz Israel? There were two possible theories. One I'll mention now, one I'll mention in a few minutes. It's based on the family of Baruch ben Neriah ben Messiah. We see in that context that I read it before, that his brother was sent to Babel to help negotiate a peace treaty. Apparently, some Mefarshim say that there was a pro-Babylonian camp that believed in making peace with Babel, which is what Yirmiyah was saying. So it makes sense that Yirmiyah and these people fit. And these people obviously did not or failed to sway Tzidkiyahu and the king at the end of the day to avoid the rebellion. They were trying to help negotiate this peace deal. So it's very possible that these people actually associated Baruch with that camp, with that pro-Babylonian camp, and saying, therefore, stick with Babel at all cost. And therefore, it's very possible that they accused Baruch, because of his family ties, of having that pro-Babylonian bias. And that's based on Nun Tet, that Perek Nun Aleph Nun Tet. On the other hand, there's another theory that has worked out more in the Midrashim, and this will lead to a point that I'm going to make in a few minutes, where that Baruch may have had a personal interest to stay in Eretz Israel for his own personal gain, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But before I do that, I just want to bring one last reference to Baruch ben Neriah in the same chapter of the Megillah, but more towards the end of it. After he's in danger, and after Yirmiyah is being pursued by Yoakim, and after it says, Vayistirem Adonai, what does Yirmiyah do? He commands Baruch, and Baruch does it, to write another Megillah. So, we're dealing with a person who is so connected to the Navi, on every level, almost at one with the Navi, in all of his difficulties, in all of his trials and tribulations, putting himself in death's reach because of his relationship with Yirmiyah, and he was able to forfeit everything to be connected to the Navi. Now, I want to move, and this will be another theory, I want to move now to the smallest chapter in the book of Yirmiyah, and that is Perek Memhe. Perek Memhe is a chapter dedicated specifically to Baruch. Nevuah specifically for Baruch, and this goes back to the 4th year of Yoakim again. Now, it's funny, Perek Lamed Vav, 4th year of Yoakim. Lamed Zayin, all the way to Mem Daled, is the description of the detailed development of Chorban HaBayit. Right? From Lamed Zayin to Mem Daled, Yirmiyahu has this long narrative describing in much greater detail than any other place in the Tanakh, Chorban HaBayit and its aftermath. The second we're done with the story, we go back to the same year of Lamed Vav, we go back to the 4th year of Yoakim, and we go back to Baruch, the scribe that wrote that Megillah. This is interesting, it's like bookends to the story. I predicted it, it happened, and now we go back to the guy who predicted it. Now, this Perek Memhe, is a Nevuah that we're addressing Baruch. הדבר אשר דיבר ירמיה הנביא אל ברוך בן נריה בכותבו הדברים האלה על ספר. So very important, it's right as he wrote the Megillah, מפי ירמיה בשנה הרביעית ליואקים בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה. Now what happens? כה אמר אדוני אלוהי ישראל עליך ברוך. Thus said God of Israel upon you Baruch. פסוק ג' אמרת אוי נא לי כי יסף אדוני יגון על מכאובי. He calls out and he said, woe to me! Hashem has added grief upon my pain. Yagati v'anchati, I've grown weary from sighs, umnuhal lo masati, and I have not found rest. Menuhal lo masati, and his brother is Sarah Menuhal. Just an important point. Meaning, he seems to be regretting something. He seems to be in serious pain, second-guessing some of his choices. And why? What was it? What made him upset? There are two approaches amongst the Mefarshim. One, which leads closest into the Pishat, but ironically is said by very few Mefarshim, but what we would guess is, look, this is a person who was with Yirmiyah all the time. Yirmiyah plenty of times gets angry and frustrated at his own lack of ability to impact the people in a serious way. He questions God. He questions why God gave him the nivuah. He curses the day he was born. He curses the person who actually brought the news to his mother about his birth. He's very upset. And this is the person who's Baruch's mentor, who he's around all the time. So it's very possible that Baruch, like Yirmiyah, was very upset. And what's interesting here is if that's the Perush, Yirmiyah here plays the role that God plays with him when he gets upset. In other words, his answers, which we'll read in a minute, which is, stop thinking about yourself, this is more serious than that, is really what God tells Yirmiyah a few times. We'll get to that in a minute. So that's one way to read the idea of what bothered him. And that would be a more simpler reading of saying, he was upset because he went through all this. But almost all the Mefarshim, including the Pashtanim, here deviate a little bit from the Peshat, and they say something striking and a little shocking, but it shows a lot of what Baruch was about. The Radak says that he wanted to be a Nevi, and he didn't receive Nevuah. Now let's get into Baruch's mind. Here's a person who's going and paying the price the Nevi has to pay at every step of the way. He's following every step correctly. But it's just not happening for him. He's not being what he believes will be a faithful recipient of a chain of tradition. He's not the next link. He's not getting the nivuah. And that bothered him. And that's why he says, Yagona lachuvi. Because no matter how hard he tried, and no matter how much he went, he didn't get it. And of course, Farshim is, why not? Why did he get it? Radak says, nothing to do with him, because it was unnecessary. Because the Hurban happened. And even people who are ra'ui for nivuah, if there's no message, cannot get nivuah. Unfortunately, we're entering to the period of Hurban and Hester Panim. God doesn't need much Nevi'im anymore. And nivuah will fall apart. So here's a person who's ready, he's there, but for reasons beyond his control, he's losing that grasp, that thing that he desires more than anything. Harambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, Helik Bet Perek Lamed Bet, says something else. He says, based on the next pasuk, when Yirmiyah answers him, what happened? Not only are they not listening to Yirmiyah and not going to Messiah, but they're blaming me. I'm the bad guy. It's not even Yirmiyah now. On one level, that's a total flawed failure. And not only that, I don't even have the connection with Borei Olam that I so desire. I'm not even a Nevi. So what is my life about? What do I have? Where am I going? And I paid the price. Time and time in on my life, I paid the price. I've stayed effective and efficient. And I gave up everything. So, what happens? And the ridicule of people, and one other point, the scribe has to always write the words of the Navi. So that's Yagona Mahuvi. It's not something that I'm involved in it. I'm writing somebody else's nivuah. It adds pain. So, what's happening? It seems that Baruch, Yirmiyah too, but certainly Baruch, becomes the ultimate tragic figure. But not so fast. The Ta'anit is ending. And so, traditionally, it's towards this end, just before Mincha, that we change our realm of learning. We always learn only the situations of suffering, but towards the end, we start seeing the things a little differently. And here's something amazing. And it happens to both Baruch, more potently, and Yirmiyah himself, which I'll get to in a minute. Who was Baruch? What happened to Baruch? It's not in the text. Hazal filled in a little gap. He says, you know what? Yirmiyah and Baruch did wind up in Mitzrayim. We know that. Yirmiyah gives his last Nebuah chronologically in Perek Mem Dalet. It's in Mitzrayim, where he yells at the people for their idolatrous practices, and they're not listening. And that's tragedy. But if we go outside of the chronology of the Megillah for a minute, and we allow Hazal to take us somewhere interesting in the Midrash, Hazal tell us, do you know where and who Baruch and Yirmiyah wound up? Well, they actually wound up in Bavel, which is plausible because Nebuzaradan offers Yirmiyah to go to Bavel. So this Hazal say, you know what? They actually did wind up in Bavel. And Yirmiyah spends the rest of his life teaching Baruch. And Baruch spends his life teaching somebody else. And he becomes the teacher and the rabbi of Ezra HaSofer. So, all of a sudden, the failure is the ultimate success. The person who rebuilt everything. The person who, look at what Hazal is telling you. This flawed person, this person who had nothing, it all failed. Everything was falling apart. He's the link. He thought he wasn't a link. He thought he's a useless non-link. He's the link between Yirmiyah, who saw the first Hurban, and Ezra, who built the second one. Maybe there's no more important person than we can imagine that links the two Batei Mikdash. Hazal said, you know who that guy is? That's this guy, Baruch ben Neriah. That's the guy who we didn't even think about. He's the teacher of Ezra HaSofer, who rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash and built Shivat Zion. Watch something else. This morning, I quoted to you, and this morning I did it in a political context. This morning, I showed Yirmiyah's choice between two kings, Yoyachin and Sidkiyahu, and Yirmiyah chooses Sidkiyahu over Yoyachin as what really could be a legitimate king. He gives his favor to that, but he chooses the Galut of Bavel, which is with Yoyachin, over the Galut over the people in Yehuda. We talked about that complexity. So I'm going to reread that pasuk in a minute, but I'm going to put a new context to it, into what we're saying. When Yirmiyah looks at Yehoiachin, who was only king for 3 months, you remember, anyone here this morning, what he called him? I don't think he's ever more insulting to anybody at all. He says, and I'll read it to you again. Hi, ani num Adonai, ki im yeh Konyahu ben Yoyakim melech Yehuda, and he calls him a melech. Even if he was a hotam al yad yamini, even if he was a signet on my finger, on my right hand, ki misham et kencha, from there I'll throw him out. Untaticha biyad mivakshei nafshecha, I'm going to give you into your enemies. Ubiyad asher yagod mipanehem, I'm going to give you into the people that you fear the most. Ubiyad Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel biyad kasdim. V'hitalti otcha, I'll throw you out. Ve'imecha, and your mother, which is true. In Melachim we see that his mother was killed, was taken with him. Asher yildatcha al aretz acheret, asher lo yuladtem sham, v'sham tamutu. Then he says, watch this, pasuk kafir. Ha'etzev nivzeh nafutz ha'ish hazeh. This person is a despised. Atzabim is a statue. Atzabehem kesef is a despised statue. He's lifeless. He has nothing. In keli en hefetzbo, an unwanted vessel. And then he says, Ko amar kodayu at ha'ish hazeh ariri. He will be childless. Given lo yutzlach BeAb, an unsuccessful person all his life. Ki lo yutzlach mizar'o ish yoshev al kisei David. And he will never have an inheritor sitting on the throne of David. Moshe lo Yehuda. This morning, we looked a little bit about the political context of Yirmiyahu's statement. His propping up of Tzidkiyahu, attempting to empower him, because it was Tzidkiyahu that was willing to listen to the message of the Navi, as opposed to the officers that were still loyal to Yoachim. So it seems that we've got this Ezra, we're going to forget about him. He's already in Galut, we have a new king. Maybe the hope will be in him, but unfortunately, Tzidkiyahu doesn't give us more much hope, and he doesn't step up, and we lose it. And now what happens? The book of Yirmiyahu ends. The last pasuk in both Melachim Bet and Yirmiyahu tells us an interesting story. Again, this is the idea of hope where you wouldn't think of it coming from. The idea of where all is lost, a forgotten vessel. Now look at what happens here. I'm going to read to you from Yirmiyahu, but you'll see the last few psukim as well in Melachim Bet. The Horban's done. We're way after the Horban. Remember, the Horban happened in the 11 years after Yoachim was sent to Galut. So now the Megillah, the Sefer Yirmiyahu switches, fast forwards to 26 years later, into the 37th year after Yoachim was sent to Galut. 26 years after Horban Habayit. ויהי ב-37 שנה לגלות יהויקים מלך יהודה ב-12 חודש ב-25 לחודש נשא אביל מרודח. Nebuchadnezzar is long dead. Nebuchadnezzar, according to tradition, died about approximately 20 years prior. Evil Melodach, when he becomes king, brings up Yoachim and he takes him out of jail. He puts him on the highest level, higher than all the other captured kings in Babel. He takes him out of his jail clothes. And he gives him food all his days. He supported all his life. That's the end of Sefer Yirmiyahu. That's how Yirmiyahu chooses to end the book. And that's how Sefer Melachim chooses to end the book. Well, what do I care? Who cares that Yoachim was taken out of jail and he was this Gavin Lo Yitzlach? Okay, it's nice to know a Gavin Lo Yitzlach who was thought nothing of. Now is getting help, is getting supported, and he's becoming somebody that's important. And at least the Vil Middledach is being nice to him. Okay, Jewish king. This guy, who Yirmiyahu said will never amount to anything, and who will never have children, sitting on the kiseh of the Melucha. I told you about Ezra Sofer. Shivat Zion happens in 2 stages. Ezra Sofer is only the 2nd stage. Anyone know who the guy that brings the people back the first time? What's his name? Anybody? I forget the Horban. And this is from the same guy who laughed while he was being killed, because he saw destruction as the beginning of rebuilding. I always give him a shout. You ever rebuild a house? You ever buy a house, you have to knock down and rebuild? What's that first happy time? When you knock the house down. Actually, Rabbi Akiva saw the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash as the actual beginning of the rebuilding of the third. That was Rabbi Akiva. That the good will come out of the ashes of the destruction. Will be the next level of Yeshua. We have a few, in terms of the second Beit HaMikdash. The one who destroyed it was King Titus, eventually the emperor, but at that point he was a general, the son of Vespasian. Titus, when he destroys the Beit HaMikdash, he comes back in great honor, the arch of Titus, and Vespasian honors him. Vespasian dies. Titus assumes to be emperor. Immediately, and this is brought not in Jewish, in secular history, everything I'm going to say now, I can read to you out of a secular book. Immediately, Rome goes on fire. Half the city burns down. Second, after that, a plague infests Rome. And then Mount Vesuvius erupts and destroys the city proper. And on his way back from visiting that eruption, he catches ill at an Olympic game. And by the way, Mount Vesuvius, when he sends people to check out what happened, they couldn't recognize the city. They didn't find it. On his way back, the Olympic Games, he catches ill, and 2 years, 2 months, and a few days after he assumes emperor, he dies. That's the end of Titus. And he said, and we don't know what this means, but it's known, secular historians write, that Titus said that he complains to God, looks up to the sky and says, why has he done this to me? I've acted justly in all my actions, except one. We don't know what he was talking about. We can only guess, and there might be other things, but that's recorded history. I'll end with a little story. And I don't know if this is true. This is folklore, but it's actually, is brought down in some non-Jewish history. Napoleon, and many of you may have heard this story. Napoleon enters into a city, and he doesn't find any inhabitants. And he finds one Jew walking with his head down. And he says, where are the inhabitants of the city? He says, come, I will take it. I will show you. And he goes, and they're in a synagogue. And in the synagogue, he sees everybody sitting and crying. And he asks, what's the matter? I'm the most important person in the world today. I'll help you guys. What do you need? No, our temple burned down. He goes, oh, really? When did that happen? How many days ago? And he's still crying. He goes, oh, no, what are you talking about? It's about 1700 years ago. He goes, what? And he turns and he said, people who have cried for 1700 years for their temple, I have no doubt that one day, for sure, they'll see it rebuilt. The point that we've been making here, the last shi'ud of Tish'a BeAb, is to understand something very profound. Throughout the Nevi'im, Tish'a BeAb is the day where we cry, where we feel a loss. And that loss is not just a lack of korbanot or a lack of Bet Mikdash. That's symptomatic of a loss of a connection to our spiritual source, to Borei Olam himself. We feel that. There is that disconnection. We don't have the connection that we so desire, that we so need to be who we are as a people. But we have to remember one thing. The salvation, the Geulah, and in our times, this message is more potent than ever, comes from the most unlikeliest of places. It comes from things that we've written off long ago. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he chooses the Geulah, doesn't guarantee us where he's going to choose it from. And it's from those ashes that everything becomes rebuilt. And we wait today, Bezrat Hashem B'Yameinu, L'Biat Mashiach Tzidkenu, and the Geulah Ke'obah. Amen.